All right, dispute and our default and dispute resolution. This is 15, default. So let's talk about this. Do you want to just kind of go through line by line?
That's best because this is a very technical paragraph or paragraphs that, and of course, if we're ever dealing with default, that just means nobody's getting paid and everybody's spending a lot of time. So I guess we need to know it. So let's go line by line.
So buyer default. If buyer fails, neglects, or refuses to perform buyer's obligation under this contract, including payment of the deposit within the time specified, seller may elect to recover and retain the deposit for the account of seller as agreed upon liquid damages, consideration for execution of this contract, and in full settlement of any claims, whereupon buyer and seller shall be relieved from all further obligations under this contract.
So let's stop there for a second.
Whew!
Yeah, that's a long sentence.
That's a long sentence. It's run-on sentence.
Right, correct. It's running way out of everything. So, in a nutshell, what that's saying is if buyer has defaulted and seller says, give me the $5,000, what the seller has now agreed to do is release the buyer from everything. Some sellers think, okay, well, I'm going to take the $5,000 and I'm going to sue the buyer for damages because I've had to make a mortgage payment, HOA dues, I've had to maintain the property, they should have closed, blah, 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 blah. So be aware that if a seller elects to retain the earnest money, they have now waived their right to sue the buyer for other damages. The other important thing in this sentence is in line 431, including payment of the deposit. Multiple times I get phone calls from realtors saying contract was signed, 3 days have passed, buyer has not remitted the EMD, therefore the contract is null and void. And I said, what 3 things does it take to bind a contract? Parties, price, location, nothing about deposit. So it doesn't mean that the contract is null and void, but it does mean that the seller has a right to declare the buyer in default for failing to comply with their responsibilities of the deposit.
So what would happen at that point?
So normally we get to the buyer's agent and go, what is the deal? Did they just forget? Have they changed their mind? What is going on? Because as long as the parties are proceeding as if we're going towards closing, then there doesn't necessarily have to be a technical default or a cancellation or anything like that. So sometimes it was just the buyer was here on vacation and forgot that they had to send in money somewhere, or said, I was waiting for somebody to give me wiring instructions and nobody ever sent me the contact information. So we'll normally contact the buyer's agent and go, what's going on?
Awesome. So when we come down to line 435, it says the portion of the deposit, if any, paid to listing broker upon default by buyer shall be split equally between listing broker and cooperating broker, provided, however, cooperating broker's share shall not be greater than the commission amount listing broker had agreed to pay to the cooperating broker.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, if there's let's just say we had a $10,000 EMD, buyer defaults, everybody agrees, the money is technically released to the seller. If you review your listing agreements, there's going to be a paragraph in there that says, in the event there is an EMD release to the seller, broker is entitled to, and then I think it's a blank line that you could fill
The
in.
default is 50%.
Okay, 50%.
Some agents say no, 0%. My personal recommendation, you had work in the deal as well. If you're the buyer agent or the listing agent, put in there 50%.
Right, and the way I interpret, if the listing agent is in control. So I did have a case where a buyer's agent called me and said, wait a second.
Is that do not disturb?
We're recording.
So I've had a buyer's agent call me.
Let's just start back over that section right there.
Which part?
Hang on one second. Let me look at this. All right. So on line Mark, on line 435, it says the portion of the deposit, if any, paid to listing broker upon default by buyer shall be split equally between listing broker and cooperating broker, provided, however, cooperating broker's share shall not be greater than the commission amount listing broker had agreed to pay to cooperating broker.
Right. So what that means is, let's say you had a contract, buyer remitted $10,000 earnest money deposit. Everybody agrees the contract was canceled. Money should be, quote, released to the seller. If you remember your listing agreement, there's going to be a paragraph in there that says, in the event something like this happens, then the listing agent is entitled to up to, and I think there's a blank line where you could put whatever percentage, but I think it defaults to
50%. Yep.
So in this case, as a listing agent, you could say, Mr. Seller, there's a $10,000. I want half of it, $5,000. But if you do that as a listing agent, then the buyer's agent is also entitled to the split payout. Now, in my opinion, I think if the listing agent says, I'm electing not to enforce my listing agreement 50%, then the buyer's agent has no right. But if
Gotcha.
the listing agent does enforce it, then the buyer's agent does have a right. And I haven't seen any case law to say I'm wrong, that a cooperating broker is what we call a third-party intended beneficiary of that listing agreement. I could be wrong, but traditionally the advice I tell the listing agent is, if you take it, you got to give it. If you don't take it, you don't have to give it.
There you go. All right. So now we come to seller default. If for any reason other than failure of seller to make seller's title marketable after reasonable diligent effort, seller fails, neglects, or refuses to perform seller's obligations under this contract, buyer may elect to receive return of buyer's deposit without thereby waiving any action for damages resulting from seller's breach, and pursuant to paragraph 16, may seek to recover such damages or seek specific performance.
Right. So this is a two-part remedy if the seller defaults. Now, specific performance, the reason we have this, there's only that one house in that one location of the world. So there's no real remedy. If you're a buyer and you are under contract to purchase and the seller just decides they're not going to comply, then you can go to court. And if you win, a judge will sign an order basically making the seller sell you that property under the terms of the contract.
Right.
That's specific performance.
Now, rarely, I mean, the seller could sue for specific performance for the buyer to buy, but that's rare that a judge would force a buyer to buy. But it may not be as rare that they would force a seller to sell.
Correct. So normally, if a seller comes to me and says, I want to force the buyer to buy, I say, all right, well, let's go over this. A lawsuit's going to take 2 years. The buyer is likely going to have acquired another piece of property. Most people don't have enough liquid cash to go close on a second property since they've already now bought another one. So the judge is going to sit there and go, in reality, how do I force a buyer to go out and get a loan? So the only time specific performance ever works in that situation is when your buyer is an investor. They pay cash to buy properties. For whatever reason, they just decide they didn't want to do it. And the seller's like, I got money, I'm going to do it. But usually not recommended. So if you're a listing agent, what you normally tell your seller, if there's a default, the best thing you're going to get, and this goes back to the 50% of the EMD, the best thing you're going to get is the earnest money deposit.
Yeah. And is it worth it? Is it worth it? Let's just get this house sold again. So there you go. And this paragraph 15 shall survive closing or termination of this contract.
Correct.
There you go. All right. Come on back. We're going to talk about dispute resolution.